The Book of Joshua is the sixth book of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, and is the first book of the secondary history, the history of Israel from the conquest of Canaan to the Babylonian exile. It recounts the Israelites' campaigns in central, southern, and northern Canaan, the destruction of their enemies, and the division of the land among the 12 tribes, framed by two main speeches, the first by God commanding the conquest of the land, and finally, the second by Joshua warning of the need to faithfully observe the law, Torah, revealed to Moses. The consensus among scholars is that the Book of Joshua is historically problematic and should be treated with caution in reconstructing the history of early Israel. The earliest parts of the book are probably chapters 2 to 11, the story of the conquest. These chapters were later included in an early form of Joshua, probably written towards the end of the reign of King Josiah, 640 to 609 before Christ, but the book was not completed until after the fall of Jerusalem to the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 586 before Christ, or perhaps after the return from Babylonian captivity in 539 before Christ. The Book of Joshua is an anonymous work. The Babylonian Talmud, written in the 3rd to 5th centuries after Christ, attributes it to Joshua himself, but this idea was rejected as untenable by John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, and by the time of Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, it was recognized that the book must have been written much later than the period it depicts. It is now generally agreed that it was composed as part of a larger work, Deuteronomy, covering the period from Deuteronomy to the books of Kings, originally composed at the court of King Josiah in the late 7th century before Christ and extensively revised in the 6th century before Christ. The prevailing scholarly opinion is that Joshua is not a factual account of historical events. The apparent setting of Joshua in the 13th century before Christ confirms the Bronze Age collapse, which was indeed a time of widespread urban destruction. However, with a few exceptions, Hazor and Lachish, the cities destroyed are not those the Bible associates with Joshua, and those it does associate with him show little or no sign of having even been inhabited at that time. Archaeological evidence suggests that Jericho and Ai were not inhabited during the Late Bronze Age in the Near East, although recent excavations at Jericho have called this into question. According to Eerdmans' Bible Dictionary, the story of the conquest represents the nationalistic propaganda of the Judean kings of the 8th century before Christ and their claims to the territory of the Kingdom of Israel, included in an early form of Joshua, written towards the end of the reign of King Josiah, reigned 640 to 609 before Christ. The Book of Joshua was probably revised and completed after the fall of Jerusalem to the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 586 before Christ and possibly after the return from the Babylonian captivity in 538 before Christ, but this is not proven. In the 1930s, Martin Knott sharply criticized the historical utility of the Book of Joshua. Knott was a student of Albrecht Alt, who emphasized the critique of form, which Hermann Gunkel had pioneered in the 19th century, and the importance of etiology. Alt and Knott postulated a peaceful relocation of the Israelites to various areas of Canaan, contrary to the biblical narrative. American archaeologist William Albright questioned the persistence of the etiologies that are central to Knott's analysis of the campaigns in Joshua. The site of Ittel, identified as Ari, was first excavated by Judith Market Krauser. Her research in the 1930s showed that the city, an early target for conquest in the supposed account of Joshua, existed and was destroyed, but in the 22nd century before Christ. Some alternative sites for Ari have been proposed, such as Khirbet el-Markathi or Khirbet Nisya, which would partially resolve the discrepancy in dates, but these sites are not widely accepted. In 1951, Kathleen Kenyon showed that City 4 at Tel es-Sultan, Jericho, was destroyed in the late Middle Bronze Age, 2100, 1550 before Christ, not in the late Bronze Age, 1550, 1200 before Christ. Kenyon argues that the early Israelite campaign cannot be historically confirmed, but rather explained as an etiology of the location and presentation of the Israelite settlement unit. Although this destruction has been dated to the 16th century by radiocarbon dating, scholars suggest that it can be attributed either to Amos I, 1549, 1524 before Christ, whose royal seal was found in the necropolis in a slightly later tomb pound 1, or to Thutmose III, 1479, 1425 before Christ, whose scarab was found in a cemetery northwest of Jericho. More recently, Lorenzo Nigro of the Italo-Palestinian expedition to Tel es-Sultan has argued that there was a later settlement, City 5, at the site in the 14th and 13th centuries before Christ. He states that the expedition found layers of late Bronze Age bodies, 2 in several parts, although the upper layers had been heavily eroded by Iron Age leveling operations, which explains the paucity of 13th century material. Nigro says that the idea that the biblical narrative must have a literal archaeological correspondence is erroneous, and any attempt to seriously identify anything at the site with biblical characters and their actions is dangerous. In 1955, George Ernest Wright discussed the correlation of archaeological evidence with the early Israelite campaigns, which he divided into 3 phases according to the Book of Joshua. He pointed to 2 sets of archaeological finds that seem to suggest that the biblical account is generally correct as to the nature of the late 13th and 12th, 11th centuries in the country, which suggests a period of great invasion. He gave particular importance to what were then recent excavations at Hazer by Igul Yardin. Archaeologist Amnon Ben-Tor of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who replaced Yardin as director of the Hazer excavations in 1990, believes that recently discovered evidence of violent destruction by burning confirms the biblical account of the conquest of the city by the Israelites. In 2012, a team led by Ben-Tor and Sharon Zuckerman discovered a burnt-out palace from the 13th century before Christ, in whose storerooms they found 3,400-year-old jars containing burnt crops. Sharon Zuckerman disagrees with Ben-Tor's theory and argues that the fire was the result of the city's many factions opposing each other with excessive force. In her commentary for the Westminster Bible Companion Series, Carolyn Pressler suggests that readers of Joshua should prioritize its theological message, what the passages teach about God, and be aware of what they would have meant to an audience in the 7th and 8th centuries before Christ. Richard Nelson explains that the needs of a centralized monarchy favored a single origin story that combined old traditions of the Exodus from Egypt, belief in a national god as a divine warrior, and explanations for the destroyed cities, social stratification, and ethnic groups, as well as modern tribes. Lester Grabe states that when he was doing his doctorate, more than 3 decades ago in 2007, that essential historicity of the biblical stories of the patriarchs and the conquest of Canaan was widely accepted, but today it is difficult to find a historian who still believes it. And Killebrew writes that while archaeological finds at Hazer and the altar on Mount Ebal, as well as several literary elements, suggest that the Book of Joshua may have preserved some real memories of Israel's early history in Canaan, there is a consensus that whatever its sources, oral or written, the conquest narrative as told is historically problematic and should be treated with caution. Fragments of the Book of Joshua dating from the Hasmonean period have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, for Q, Josh A, and for Q, Josh B, found in Qumran Cave 4. The Septuagint, Greek translation, is found in manuscripts such as the Washington Manuscript 1, 5th century after Christ, and a reduced version of the Septuagint text is found in the illustrated Joshua scroll. The earliest complete copy of the book in Hebrew is found in the Aleppo Codex dating from 10th century after Christ. The main theological theme of Deuteronomy is the faithfulness and mercy of God, and their opposites, unfaithfulness and wrath of God. In the book of Judges, the books of Samuel, and the books of Kings, the Israelites become unfaithful, and God ultimately shows his wrath by sending his people into exile. But in Joshua, Israel is obedient, Joshua is faithful, and God fulfills his promise and gives them the land as a result. Yahweh's military campaign in Canaan confirms Israel's right to the land and provides a paradigm for how Israel was to live there. 12 tribes, with a designated leader, united by covenant in war and in the worship of Yahweh alone at one sanctuary, all in obedience to the commandments of Moses, as found in the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Joshua develops the theme from Deuteronomy of Israel as a united people worshipping Yahweh in the land that God had given them. Yahweh, as the book's main character, takes the initiative in conquering the land, and Yahweh's power wins the battles. For example, the walls of Jericho fall because Yahweh fights for Israel, not because the Israelites show superior fighting ability. The potential disunity of Israel is a constant theme, with the greatest threat of disunity coming from the tribes east of the Jordan. Chapter 22 verse 19 even implies that the land beyond the Jordan is unclean and that the tribes living there have a secondary status. The Promised Land is the central theme of Joshua. The introduction to Deuteronomy recalls how Yahweh gave the land to the Israelites but then withdrew the gift when Israel showed fear and only Joshua and Caleb trusted God. The land is Yahweh's to give or to keep, and the fact that he promised it to Israel gives Israel the inalienable right to take it. For exilic and post-exilic readers, the land was both a sign of Yahweh's faithfulness and Israel's unfaithfulness, as well as a center of their ethnic identity. In Deuteronomy, rest refers to Israel's fearless possession of the land, which began with Joshua's conquests. Joshua carried out a systematic campaign against the civilian population of Canaan, men, women, and children, amounting to total annihilation. This practice is known as Hiram, as described in Deuteronomy 20 verse 17, which involves no treaties with the enemy, no mercy, and no intermarriage. The destruction of the nations glorifies Yahweh as a warrior and furthers Israel's claim to the land, while their continued survival explores the themes of disobedience and punishment and anticipates the story told in Judges and Kings. The divine call for annihilation at Jericho and elsewhere can be explained in terms of cultural norms. Israel was not the only Iron Age state to practice Hiram and theology, for example, to ensure Israel's purity, to fulfill God's promise, to judge the Canaanites for their depraved sexual behavior. Patrick Miller, in his commentary on Deuteronomy, writes that there is no real way to make such accounts palatable to the hearts and minds of modern readers and believers, and that the tension between the Israelites and their neighbors was fundamentally a religious conflict, writing further of the need to understand what the accounts teach so that they can make some sense to us as a whole. Miller further writes that Deuteronomy from Joshua to 2 Kings is a history of constant or recurring apostasy, and that for the Israelites, maintaining their loyalty to Yahweh required, in their eyes, the removal of all temptation. Nissim Amzalag sees similarities between Joshua's conquest and the return of the Jewish exiles in Ezra and Nehemiah, but in the former, the Jews simply refrained from intermarriage with the Canaanite. These Canaanites were most likely corrupt Jews who had been contaminated by foreign influence. Obedience versus disobedience is a constant theme of the work. Obedience is associated with the crossing of the Jordan River, the defeat of Jericho and Ai, circumcision, and the Passover, as well as the public exposition and reading of the law. Disobedience appears in the stories of Achan, stoned for violating the commandment of Hiram, the Gibeonites, and the altar built by the Transjordanian tribes. Joshua's two final addresses challenge future Israel, the readers of the story, to obey the most important commandment of all, to worship Yahweh and no other gods. In this way, Joshua illustrates the central message of Deuteronomy, that obedience leads to success and disobedience to ruin. Deuteronomy draws parallels in the proper leadership of Moses, Joshua, and Josiah. God's assignment to Joshua in chapter 1 is presented as a royal appointment. The oath of allegiance of the people to Joshua as Moses' successor is reminiscent of royal practices. The covenant renewal ceremony led by Joshua was the prerogative of the Judean kings. God's command to Joshua to meditate on the book of the law the day and night is consistent with the description of Josiah in 2 Samuel 23 verse 25 as a king uniquely concerned with the study of the law. The two figures have identical territorial goals. Josiah died in 609 before Christ while attempting to annex the former Israel to his own kingdom of Judah. Some modern biblical scholars believe that the conquest of Canaan was not an event of secular but of theological significance. They seek in the book of Joshua a perspective different from the modern one. In the schematic, colored with epic scenes, narrative related to the personality of Joshua, they find above all the religious perspective. However, this type of narrative does not deprive the book of its historical value. A number of archaeological studies confirm the existence and location of many cities mentioned in the book, discovering the beginning of Israelite civilization in the mentioned lands. The stagnation in the development of culture and technology in the transition from the Bronze to the Iron Age, 13th century before Christ, in these lands is definitely connected with the capture of cities such as Bethel, Lachish, Eglon, Debir and Hazor. Archaeological excavations of ancient fortified cities, Magedon, Gezer, and Bethshan, as well as other written monuments, prove that horses and war chariots were used in military operations as early as the time of Joshua. However, the Israelites were poorly armed and their victories were due to military cunning, surprise and, above all, to their God. After acquiring war trophies, the Israelites, although they already knew how to use war chariots, crippled the horses and burned the chariots, as this was a command from God. The book of Joshua can be better understood by understanding its religious purpose. The conquest of Canaan has primarily a religious significance. The Israelites meet their God in the wilderness and through the covenant they make with him they promise him their loyalty. In return for their loyalty, God promises them a land and through his servant Joshua he divides it among the Israelite tribes. The conquest and division of the land are presented as a work in the service of the Lord. The central idea of the book is the promised land. What in the Pentateuch is the subject of promise becomes reality here. The promised land is an expression of God's faithfulness to the Israelites and of the Israelites' faithfulness to their God. Through the conquest of Canaan and the division of the land among the Israelite tribes, the promise given to the ancestors and to Moses is simply fulfilled. The book of Joshua encourages believers that the promised land, although given as a gift, must be conquered. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the Moses Film channel and give the video a thumbs up in support.